Hey class, this is Dr. Maples, ready to get our lecture started in our research methods class. First things we're going to do is talk about how we know what we think we know. We're going to talk about some ways that we get knowledge. We're also going to talk about some basics of what research methods are and why we're even thinking about this in sociology. Let's get started. So first off, I have something to tell you, and you're not going to believe it, but my students control the weather. It's true. Walk through with this, if you will, so that I can explain this to you, because this is true knowledge. This is the truth. My students control the weather. All right, here we go. The weather is always hottest when my students are gone. That's actually what I noticed. My students leave, bam, it starts getting warmer. And in fact, when there's the fewest students on campus, it's when it's the hottest. Now, I noticed that when my students start returning to campus in the fall, it starts to cool. And in fact, as more and more students gather, I start to really notice a change in the weather. It cools down, the leaves start to fall. And it's actually I noticed that when the height of students are on campus, it's really at its coldest. And then what happens that with the second semester going into the spring, my students start missing more classes and there's fewer and fewer students on campus. And I notice that it starts melting the snow and the ice and it gradually gets warmer. In fact, around spring break, there's really not a lot of students on campus. We usually have beautiful weather and it gets warmer and warmer. And then right after graduation, all the students go away and it becomes hot again. Ergo, my students control the weather. Do they? Oh, of course they don't. You know I'm being silly. But do you see how that knowledge is flawed? Do you kind of see how that's weird? I make a very compelling argument, but I even kind of mention things like spring and fall and winter, the passage of time, in explaining how my students somehow change the weather. Now, what really changes the weather? I don't know. This isn't that kind of class, but it's definitely not my students. Now, humans are really observant. In fact, it's one of the things that as a species, we do really well to some capacity, but then we kind of get blinders on. And so I kind of want to talk about knowledge and where we often get knowledge from that can be sort of problematic. In fact, I want to give you 4 ways our textbook talks about this. So first off, as we observe things, sometimes we make what we call an informal observation. That means that we have no system of any form to verify that something is true. Have you ever heard the 10-mile over speed limit rule? This was something that I was told as a child, that basically as long as you were going less than 10 miles over the speed limit, the police officer won't pull you over. I've never tested that, but I'm not sure that's true. What's the facts? Oh, it's a thing. Oh, that's what we call a myth. That's what that feels like to me. It kind of seems legit at face value. It even passes the sniff test a little bit. Is that, a logical idea? Well, it makes sense, but is it true? We really don't know. There's no support to that. This is an informal observation. We really don't know if it's true. And every once in a while, too, we choose to see what we're going to decide is true. This is what we call a selective observation. Have you ever had a moment where someone was so annoying that every little thing they did from that moment on, you just found ways that it was annoying, and you decided that they were an annoying person? That's selective observation. You're seeing what you want to see. Maybe you decide a particular professor is lazy or no good at their job. From that moment on, you become very critical, and every little thing that you see goes wrong, you say that, well, that's evidence that this is the case. But it's selective. We're not really testing everything that they do. And believe me, there's not a lot of lazy professors out there. This is the wrong job for being lazy. I take that back. There's probably a few lazy professors. Kenneth, can we edit that out? Yeah, good. Okay, good. Kenneth's going to edit that out. With selective observations, we don't have the evidence to back it up. Now, occasionally we also like to overgeneralize. In fact, my daughter did this one day. She ate at Taco Bell, and she said Taco Bell is the best restaurant on the planet. All Taco Bells are this awesome. I said, Josie, how many Taco Bells have you eaten at in your lifetime? Well, the one in Berea and the one in Martin, Tennessee. But that surely represents all Taco Bells in the world, right? Of course not. In fact, I've eaten at some Taco Bells where I had a strong sense of regret within 10 minutes of eating there. This is an overgeneralization. We're taking one or two cases and saying, well, that's always true. It's kind of similar to that selective observation too, isn't it? You see where those overlap a little bit? Yeah. Sometimes too, we just take the word of authorities as being true without testing that as well. The knowledge that I got from my parents has been occasionally valuable, but much of what they told me, I've found that a lot of it just doesn't really hold true. Even some of the very specific things that they said were always true, no, they don't always hold true. We can see where even though we're really great at observing things, the knowledge that we gain ourselves and that we glean from other people can often be fraught with problems. In fact, the truth of the matter is so much of our everyday knowledge, not our scientific knowledge, but our everyday knowledge of how we understand this world working is just a nightmare of unproven guesswork. Our brains are literally just trying to wrap its heads around all these different themes that are happening out there, many of which are just made up in our heads. Truth be told, so many of our own biases and the lies that we've been told in the past kind of pull the wool over our eyes for the truth today. So when we look at knowledge, what's a person to do? How do we assess knowledge? How do we understand what is really true knowledge? And more importantly, those last four examples, if we needed to prove or disprove those, how do we go about doing that? How do I go about rejecting or accepting some of the ideas that I propose in the previous thing? If I need to prove what causes the weather to change, how do I test that? It's definitely not by watching my students. It's by using research methods. The whole point of this class. Research methods are here to help. And here's the cool thing. You know how to do research methods. You've had the scientific method drilled into your head since like 5th or 6th grade. It's a basic systematic process. What we're doing is rather than just making up our own way of creating knowledge, we're using a systematic, agreed upon by all the scientists back in the Age of Enlightenment. We didn't get much say in it, right? The way that they felt was a logical, reasonable way for you to create new knowledge and to assess old knowledge. In fact, that's why we have hypotheses. That's why we turn to literature to see what others have said. That's why we have a testing process where we analyze data and we go through disproving our hypotheses and more. You're totally familiar with this. In fact, because of that, you're going to have no problem in this class whatsoever. You're going to be an all-star from moment one. Isn't that great? It's going to be awesome. I really look forward to seeing some of your assignments, but that's for another day. Research methods give us a really great way to assess what's true and what isn't true. It gives us a way to understand not just the limited evidence that we as an individual might see, but the evidence that's all the evidence that's out there, or in some cases to take a sample of that evidence and know that we have a good representation of the evidence even though we can't collect it all. Now, it's cool because this goes right back to the scientific method. In fact, when we think about sociology as a field, that's really where we get our root. We get our root in the Age of Enlightenment and that scientific method. Science, in fact, is a way that we go about creating new knowledge, an empirical system for creating knowledge that we can trust and we know is true because we use the scientific method, the agreed upon way of creating knowledge, to do it. And scientists will review your work and tell you if you did a good job and this knowledge is acceptable, or if you did a bad job and you need to go back and reassess your knowledge. Science is a systematic way for seeking the truth of what exists in our reality. That's exciting, isn't it? Now, it's not part of our lecture necessarily, but if we go back in time, we saw that in many cases, society was getting what we call authoritative or mystical knowledge. This was knowledge often coming from sources of power, like kings and queens, or even people who explained the origin of our society, such as a church. And you couldn't really argue with those. In fact, that's why the scientific knowledge was so valuable, because it gave us a stance for saying, well, you know, we appreciate that you think that the Earth is the center of the universe, but maybe the sun is, and here's the science that proves the sun is the center of our universe. I got a couple people excommunicated. Nonetheless, science is a critical, systematic way for us to seek the truth about what we understand. We're going to do that in this class. We're going to seek the truth about the things that we're researching. Now, again, we got our roots as a science, and science in general gets its roots in the Age of Enlightenment. This was around 1650 to about 1790. This was an extraordinary period of upheaval in world history where we challenged old ideas and created all this amazing new knowledge about the world. People were experiencing higher rates of literacy, and they were having conversations about why we existed, what this world was about, and what we were doing. And going forward, how did we explain things like why stuff falls off tables? Well, it turns out there's value in that, and we can use science to do that. Now later, a term called social science would be used to delineate so-called hard sciences, things like chemistry, biology, geology, and who were trying to understand how the planet functioned, from sciences that were dedicated to understanding how things were organized, or how the individual thought. This ends up being the realm of sociology, psychology, philosophy, and history. Now, I'm one of those sociologists who says, no, sociology is a hard science. Our original name was social physics. So I think that says a lot about what Comte was thinking about. We're not really a social science. In fact, if you want to argue we are a social science, I think we're the social science, because the others are thinking about individuals, about morality, about ethics, about history and the past. Whereas we're trying to understand the relationships between all these individuals and the things happening around them. Or for those of you who are fans of the sociological imagination, that would be C. Wright Mills thinking about individual experiences in history, all the stuff happening around these biographies, these individual experiences. So that's my take on that. I think that we are, in fact, a hard science, but what else? Nonetheless, that's where we get our roots in trying to understand what's happening in this social organization and how we can not only follow through with our two commitments of sociology, the idea that we will observe our society and study it and understand it, but two, that we will create social change where possible to avoid bad stuff happening. Now, with science and sociology was cool because it just really had this dynamic role in the place that ends up being created. With psychology, this was a field mostly focused on thinking about the individual mind and what's going on inside the individual. Sociology added to that by saying, well, look, it's not about the individual, it's about all the individuals and all the stuff happening around us. Likewise, history, they were just turned around and looking at the past, and sociologists were like, yeah, the past is important because that's one of the things that shapes our experiences that we've made both in the past and the decisions we make today, but also the decisions that we might make in the future. Philosophy was just really trying to focus on why we were here, and sociologists are like, that's great, but we're trying to think about the day-to-day realities of how we function as a species, not so much the morality of it. Maybe there's a little morality in sociology because we are concerned about things like poverty. Nonetheless, sociology was the only one that really put its individual collective experience and its past in trying to understand the perspective of how events shape the individual's experience. And it's exciting because as researchers, we hold a very important, exciting realm in the world of science. We're the ones who do this kind of stuff. And it's great because we have finally come to that magic moment where sociology is really being respected at a deep level. We're, so to speak, the cool people at the party now. And you know what it took? It took Silicon Valley to explode and create all this technology and realize that they need sociologists to understand really what these data about all these people mean, because we are the field that studies all those social interactions and how all these things shape our decision making. So it's a great time to be a sociology major. We are truly the coolest people at the party right now, and the job market is open to us in very magical ways, something that we'll talk about a lot in the spring, by the way, and I'll also bring up periodically this semester. So for sociologists, we're in a good spot. Now, scientists were obsessed at the time and even today with basically you create knowledge, you have it peer reviewed where other people agree your knowledge is good, you publish it, you go on to the next thing. Sociologists still do that occasionally, but I gotta be honest, sociologists saw a problem with that. You know, if you publish an extraordinary paper and no one reads it, nothing happens, and that happens every day. In fact, I've published articles that I'm pretty confident less than 5 people on this planet have ever even read. What good did that do? It didn't. Unless something amazing happened from those handful of people that read that research, it changed nothing. And that is where we have a failure of these two important components, these commitments of sociology, that we first understand society, and that second, we're committed to making social change at the appropriate places and making sure that we can make this thing better. In fact, that's where sociology seems a bit of a split to happen. We see basic science, what I've always called academic sociology or academic science, dedicated to just trying to publish your research, and then it's to the bar and that's done, and you just move on to the next project. That's a separate field that doesn't have value. For me, there were two fields of sociology, and to be honest, the textbook splits them into two, and I feel they're just one. But there are two fields of sociology that were dedicated to taking the research that you and I will create and making a difference with it by applying it to our communities. The first was applied sociologist. Now, this definitely describes me, and thinking about our program, I think this also describes Dr. McSpirit would be another good example of that. Applied sociologists are far more interested in trying to study ideas that others need explored in the community. Let's say that Lee County needs a needs assessment study done of what their high school students want to see happening in the community after graduation and what would help keep them at home. Sociologists can do that research. And we're not concerned about publishing it. We're concerned about getting it in a digestible report format that I can hand to people in Lee County and say, this is what we find and this is what we suggest. And then they can take that information and put that into action. Likewise, public sociologists are similarly doing sociology work in communities, but they're thinking about sort of bigger public issues, things like racism, health, inequalities, poverty. These are the kinds of things that they're thinking about at a much bigger level that impact those communities, but aren't necessarily working directly with them. Now, for me, there was a whole lecture in 2007 or 2008 with the president of the American Sociological Association about applied and public sociology. I treat them as one and the same because both of them are far more interested in creating social change than sitting on research. That's in fact what we're going to be thinking about as we go forward. Now, here's what I want to do. I want to call our lecture for there. In our next lecture, we're going to continue to think about how science and sociology is a little different and also the same. We're also going to think, too, a little bit about sociology's lab space and where we do our work. So if you have questions, you write me. Otherwise, follow up with me in our next lecture, and we'll wrap this one up. Thanks.